It's no secret to queer people that being non-binary in a language with grammatical gender can be complicated. Obviously, because language just reflects your perceptions of things, there's a big interplay between how people want to be perceived and how they perceive themselves, and how they use language to reflect that. And being non-binary, just anything that involves not conforming to the strict male or female definitions, that's definitely not a new concept. It's been in various cultures around the world for centuries and millennia and yada yada yada. It's not new. But of course, since language is dictated by culture and, worldview, society, etc., since being non-binary is new in Western society, or relatively new, again, lots of history behind it. Anyway, since being non-binary is relatively new in Western society, languages spoken by Western societies, like, Germanic languages, Romance languages, etc., still kind of have to catch up to it. There are holes in how you refer to non-binary people and how non-binary people want to be referred to that need to be filled. And it's not always a difficult job. Like, take English, for example. English has standard third-person singular pronouns he, she, and it. But it's got a little extra one. It's got they, the epicene. Epicene they is used to refer to people who you don't know their gender. So, someone's at the door, tell them to go away. That kind of use of the word they has been in practice for, hundreds of years. It's not a new thing. But since English has got this singular pronoun that is used when you don't know the gender of a person, it can easily be co-opted to be used to refer to a person whose gender doesn't fall within those he, she labels. Of course, using they is a little bit complicated. There's like the verb conjugations, he eats, she eats, it eats, they eat. People using the they pronoun, they, them pronouns sometimes sound plural because of verb conjugations in English, but it can generally be figured out based off of context. And so generally in English, you only need to worry about pronouns and actual gender-specific words like man, woman, husband, wife. But in languages with grammatical gender, it suddenly becomes more complicated because not only are you worrying about, whether the noun that you use aligns with your gender in terms of its actual meaning and if the pronouns align with your actual identity, but you're also worrying about whether adjectives align with your actual identity, whether, masculine or feminine or whatever inflection of an adjective aligns with your identity. And this is still a problem even if the language in question with grammatical gender has more than just masculine and feminine gender. Like, for example, in English we have the neuter pronoun it, which is, called neuter because we don't use it to refer to men or women. We use it to refer to, like, chairs and shit, at least in standard English. But a lot of non-binary people don't want to be called it. Anything referred to as it is typically non-human. And that's what non-binary people have grown up hearing. They've grown up, seeing it, reading it. And so if they get referred to as it inherently feels dehumanizing because the only other places they've heard it spoken are in the context of inanimate objects and animals, non-human things. And so even though English has, in terms of grammatical gender, literally a neuter pronoun, one that doesn't refer to male or female gender, it still doesn't quite feel right because of the context that it's used in. And the same thing can apply to, Russian. Russian has three grammatical genders. It's got masculine, feminine, and neuter, and plural as well. But the neuter generally isn't used by non-binary people because it sounds like you're talking about an inanimate object or a non-human thing. And not just in terms of pronouns, but in terms of, conjugations of verbs and how you agree adjectives, stuff like that. In languages with grammatical gender, there's often just way more gaps where non-binary people sort of don't feel like anything refers to them. Using the standard form of the language or the traditional form of the language, there's just a gap that they fall into. There are a few ways that people compensate for this. One is to use, pronouns that already kind of work, like the epicene in English that I just talked about. Another way is to just invent new pronouns like sie, them, sie. Most of you would know them as neo-pronouns. Or you can switch between them, people with any all pronouns, people who alternate between he and him and they and whatever. But of course, not all of these strategies work for everyone. They tend to be better suited to certain identities than others. If your gender identity, you feel like it sort of changes, you can feel masculine one day and feminine the next day, then using one, they, which isn't exclusive to either, might not feel right. You might prefer to use the any all approach where you switch between them. In a moment, I'm going to go into various languages with grammatical gender and go through how, gender neutrality is worked into them. First, I want to just clarify that having grammatical gender in your language isn't always seen as a problem for non-binary people, because grammatical gender isn't social gender. There's a great video about this, by I can't remember who that I watched recently, and they talk about, I'm using the epicene pronoun because I don't know the person's gender, and I didn't do my research before recording this. But the video basically talked about how we in the English-speaking world tend to view grammatical gender as aligning to the social genders, masculine, feminine, those traditional social ideas, even though grammatical gender is much more language-based, it's much more abstract, it doesn't have such a strong correlation to actual sex and actual gender identity. And so let's now look at how various languages with grammatical gender implicate gender neutrality in their language. And I'm not talking about, if the language already has ways of coping with people who don't fall within male or female, already has words and gender neutral words and pronouns for that. I'm talking about languages where it's a new thing, where people are having to come up with new strategies to deal with this, the hole that their language has. In Swedish, there are, I don't know how these are pronounced, I just have them written down, so you'll have to forgive me, but you've got the masculine third-person singular pronoun han, and then the feminine pronoun hon, and people in... it started in 1966 and then got popular in the 2010s. People started using a neuter pronoun hen to refer to people in general. Spanish has the masculine el and then the feminine ella. I apologize for that pronunciation. And so in recent years, people have come up with the pronoun ella to refer to people in general without any sort of gender-specific, gender binary-specific connotations. But there's also the problem of, Spanish has full-on grammatical gender. Adjectives have to agree to the grammatical gender of the nouns that they modify. There's mosquitoes everywhere. You know this, masculine takes the ending o, and then feminine takes the ending a. How do you deal with this? One example that a lot of you may have heard of is replacing o or a with just an x, which is where you get latinx from. I think that's how it's pronounced. And obviously it's meant to just express non-exclusivity to male or masculine Latino and then feminine Latina. But there's an obvious problem here. How do you pronounce latinx? How does that work exactly? It works fine in writing, but how do you say it? The problem is writing is a reflection of spoken speech, not the other way around. And so having a solution that only works for the written word isn't really a full solution. And so the most common solution that works for both spoken and written speech is the at the end. Instead of o or a, just e. Welsh is even more complicated in a way because you've got mutation. Basically, if a word is being possessed by another word, its sort of actual sounds change corresponding to the possessor. And so it's not just like in Spanish where the suffix changes, basically the word itself changes in a very inalienable way from the grammatical gender of Welsh. And so how do you cope with that when Welsh has only the masculine and feminine mutations, those two options for a noun being possessed? The solution that most non-binary people seem to have come to is to just not mutate the noun, to just use its plain form. I've got to put my hoodie on because there's so many mosquitoes and I'm worried that they're eating my ears and shit. Cornish has wicked new non-binary pronouns that have just been invented. And I don't know if they've caught on. I'm not really in the Cornish community, but I know that they have been, thought up by some big name Cornish revitalization dude. And they're not just gender neutral pronouns, they're specifically for non-binary people. And how these pronouns were come up with is that Proto-Celtic had a series of neuter gender pronouns which didn't survive into Cornish, and so this person's just gone and looked at those old pronouns and then just run them through the sound changes from Proto-Celtic into Cornish and basically come up with hypothetical ways that those pronouns would have looked if they had survived into modern Cornish. Russian is, in my opinion, the most interesting one because Russia is a shit-ass place for queer people. It's incredibly difficult for non-binary people to even, have their gender identity accepted by people in general, let alone make it work with the language that they speak. There's not really a consensus on how non-binary people should be linguistically treated in Russian like there kind of is in English. I shouldn't say consensus on how they should be treated, more like a common way that they choose to be treated. There's not one of those like there is in English. And I think part of the reason that there's no, clear consensus, clear common thing is because they've got much bigger fights to deal with than how they speak. They have much bigger problems to concern themselves with in terms of being recognized as non-binary. The past tense of verbs actually, has to correspond with grammatical gender. Take the verb, I don't know the infinitive, I don't know Russian that well, but like я думаю, in order to put that into past tense, you have to think about the grammatical gender of the person думаю-ing. And so masculine would be думал, a feminine would be думала. And so what do you do with your non-binary? Well, one solution to this that I've seen, and I don't know if it's caught on, I don't know if it's any kind of consensus, is just a fully new verb ending, which is думахши. One thing that I want to clarify, though, in reference to all of these languages, most of these gender neutrality efforts in these languages, changing gender-specific nouns to be more gender-neutral and changing pronouns to be more gender-neutral, a lot of them were pioneered by 20th century feminist movements. Non-binary folks tend to be a sort of afterthought to the invention and pioneering of these various gender-neutral language features. And of course, there's a good reason for this. A lot of languages tend to have a male bias in, regardless of if it actually reflects how people think, there's still a language-based gender bias. And you see this in, English has all those names for occupations that end with man, like fireman, postman, but you've also got things like in Spanish, the phrase or pair of words, hombre público, means public man, literally. It's just its literal translation. But mujer pública means prostitute. And so, a lot of these, gender-neutral ways of going about these gendered languages have been pioneered by feminists, but they can still be applied to great use for the non-binary community. All right, that was a little bit of a rambling video. I'm terribly sorry about how rambly that was, but I think I still got it across. I'll try and edit it down to a coherent state afterwards. Thank you for listening or watching. I'll see you next week. Have a nice week in the meantime.